November 8, 1979. At the Orpheum Theatre, Vancouver, Bob Marley was halfway through "I Shot the Sheriff" when 30 armed police officers stormed in, looking for someone in the crowd who would change everything. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Bob had just sung "I shot the sheriff, but I didn't shoot no deputy" when the theater doors exploded open. Not knocked, not pushed, exploded. 30 Vancouver Police Department officers in full tactical gear poured in like water through a broken dam, rifles raised, shields up, a German shepherd barking. The music died instantly. Carlton Barrett's drumstick hung frozen in midair. The bass note from Family Man's guitar seemed to hover in the sudden silence before fading into nothing. 3,000 people turned as one organism toward the commotion at the back of the Orpheum Theatre. Bob Marley stood center stage, microphone in hand, sweat glistening on his face under the hot lights. His eyes narrowed as he watched the police fan out across the back of the venue. But what happened in the next 7 seconds would determine whether this became a riot or a revolution. The lead officer, a mountain of a man named Sergeant Roy McKinnon, raised a megaphone. "Nobody move. We're looking for Samuel Running Bear, Indigenous male, 23 years old, wanted for terrorism against the Canadian government." The crowd bristled. Half of them started to stand. The other half pushed back in their seats. But Bob Marley did something nobody expected. He laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a bitter laugh, a deep, rolling laugh that somehow carried through the entire theater without amplification. Then he spoke into his microphone, his voice calm as still water, but with something underneath, something dangerous. "Terrorism?" Bob said. "Against the government? Brothers and sisters, you know what this young man's terrorism was?" McKinnon shouted through his megaphone. "Sir, step back and let us." "His terrorism," Bob continued, ignoring the sergeant completely, "was standing at a pipeline that would destroy his grandmother's burial ground. His weapon was his body. His bomb was his voice, saying no more." What nobody in that theater knew yet was that Samuel Running Bear was actually in the building. The young Indigenous man was crouched in the lighting booth above the stage, having volunteered to work the spotlight for the concert. He'd been hiding for 6 days, moving between safe houses in Vancouver's downtown east side, when he heard Bob Marley was coming to town. He'd spent his last $20 on a ticket before discovering the show was sold out. That's when Maria Gonzalez, the Orpheum's lighting director and secret sympathizer with Indigenous land rights, offered him a job for the night. Nobody would look for a fugitive actually working at the concert he was attending. But now, watching 30 officers sweep through the crowd with flashlights, Samuel knew it was over. They'd found him. Someone had talked. His hand moved to the letter in his pocket. His testimony about what really happened at the pipeline protest, about the agent provocateurs, about the government's plan to criminalize Indigenous resistance. He'd planned to give it to Bob Marley after the show, hoping maybe somehow a voice that big could make people listen. Down on stage, Bob set down his guitar. The Wailers exchanged nervous glances. Peter Tosh moved his hand toward the machete he kept behind his amplifier, a habit from Jamaica. But Bob raised his hand slightly, and Tosh stopped. "Sergeant," Bob called out, "what you call terrorism, we call survival. What you call criminal, we call human. This Samuel Running Bear, what did he blow up? That's not relevant." "What did he blow up?" Bob's voice boomed through the PA system. McKinnon faltered. The truth was, Samuel hadn't blown up anything. The official charges were conspiracy to commit terrorism and threatening critical infrastructure. The reality was that Samuel had chained himself to a bulldozer. When police tried to remove him, he'd sung traditional songs. When they pepper sprayed him, he'd kept singing. When they brought dogs, he'd sung louder. It took 17 officers to carry him away. And even then, he hadn't stopped singing. The threat was that his actions had inspired dozens of others to join him. The terrorism was that he'd made the oil company look bad on the evening news. He didn't blow up anything, did he? Bob pressed. He stood in front of a machine, like that man in Tiananmen Square will stand in front of a tank someday, like Rosa Parks sat in a seat. Standing is not terrorism. Standing is human. The crowd began to murmur agreement. Someone shouted, "Let us listen to music." Another voice, "Get out, pigs." The tension ratcheted up another notch. But then something extraordinary happened that nobody could have predicted. A grandmother in the third row stood up. She was maybe 70, white-haired, wearing a hand-knitted sweater with a maple leaf on it. She looked like everyone's Canadian grandmother. She raised her weathered hand and spoke in a voice that somehow carried. "That boy saved my granddaughter," she said. The theater went silent. Even the police stopped moving. 6 months ago, at the protest, the grandmother continued. The police horses charged the crowd. My 16-year-old granddaughter Sophie fell. The crowd was stampeding. That boy, Samuel Running Bear, threw himself over her, took the trampling himself. 3 broken ribs, internal bleeding. He nearly died, protecting a white girl he'd never met. She turned to face the police directly. "If he's a terrorist, then so am I. Arrest me too." Another person stood up. Then another. Within 30 seconds, half the audience was on their feet. Not aggressively, just standing, silent, witnessing. Sergeant McKinnon's hand moved to his radio. Bob saw it and knew. Reinforcements meant riot police, meant tear gas, meant people would die. Not might die, would die. He'd seen it in Jamaica, in Zimbabwe. The mathematics of crowds and fear always equaled blood. That's when Bob Marley did the thing that would be studied in conflict resolution classes for decades. "Sergeant McKinnon," Bob said, and the officer froze. Surprised Bob knew his name. "You have children?" "That's not—" "You have children?" Bob repeated. "2 daughters," McKinnon answered. "Not sure why." "And if your daughters were at a concert, just trying to hear music, trying to feel alive for a few hours in this cold world, and 30 men with guns came in, how would you want those men to behave?" McKinnon's hand stayed on his radio, but didn't key it. "I have children too," Bob continued. 7 of them. You know what I teach them? I teach them that the uniform doesn't make the man. The man makes the uniform. Right now you have a choice. You can be the uniform. Do what you're told. Follow orders. Arrest a young man whose only crime was protecting his ancestors' land. Or you can be a man. A father who understands that sometimes the law and justice are not the same thing. The theater was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the stage lights, but unknown to everyone below, Samuel Running Bear was making his own choice in the lighting booth. Samuel stood up. Maria grabbed his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "They'll kill you." "No," Samuel said. "Bob's right. Standing is not terrorism. Hiding is." He opened the booth door and started down the metal stairs. Each footstep rang out in the silence. Clang, 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 like a countdown to catastrophe. The police heard it. Their weapons swung toward the sound. Fingers moved to triggers. Someone was coming down from above. In tactical terms, it was a nightmare scenario. Threat from elevated position, 3,000 potential casualties in the crossfire. But Bob Marley started to sing. Not a song anyone knew, not reggae, something older, a melody that seemed to come from the earth itself. No words, just a hum that built into a wail that became a prayer. The wailers, confused but trusting, began to provide a rhythm, soft, hypnotic, like a heartbeat. Samuel appeared on the side of the stage. 23 years old, long black hair, wearing a concert volunteer t-shirt, no weapons, hands visible. He looked impossibly young. The police tensed. 30 weapons tracked his movement. But the crowd did something unprecedented. 3,000 people began to hum along with Bob. Not the same note, a harmony that seemed to arise spontaneously. The sound filled the Orpheum, making the walls vibrate. It was beautiful and terrifying simultaneously. It sounded like what angels might sound like if angels were angry. Samuel walked to center stage. Bob handed him the microphone. Another layer of irony. "I shot the sheriff," interrupted by actual sheriffs, now the accused, given the mic. "My name is Samuel Running Bear," he said, his voice steady despite everything. "I am Squamish Nation. The land this theater sits on is unceded territory of my people. You call me a terrorist. I call myself a protector." Sergeant McKinnon started forward, but Bob stepped between them. "Let him speak," Bob said. "You've had your say with your guns and your badges. Let him have his say with his words." "I can't." "You can," Bob interrupted. "You're a human being with free will. You can choose. Every officer here can choose. Follow orders blindly or think about what you're really doing." That's when the impossible happened. One of the police officers lowered his weapon. Constable Jennifer Liu, 5 years on the force, daughter of Chinese immigrants, stepped forward and removed her helmet. "Sarge," she said quietly, "maybe we should hear him out." "Liu, get back in formation." But she didn't move. "My grandfather was arrested for terrorism too. His crime was trying to stop the internment camps during World War II. Sometimes the law is wrong, Sarge." Another officer, Constable James Thompson, Indigenous himself, though he'd hidden it to join the force, lowered his rifle. "The kid's right about the land," he said quietly. The thin blue line began to crack, and in that crack, something else could grow. But first, Samuel Running Bear had to tell them what really happened at the pipeline. 2 weeks ago, Samuel began, still holding Bob's microphone. "They brought in provocateurs, fake protesters with Molotov cocktails. We tried to stop them. We told the real police they weren't with us, but the arrest order had already been written. They needed terrorists, so they created some." From his pocket, he pulled out a small cassette recorder. This is a recording of Officer Dennis Blake discussing the plan 2 days before the protest. He pressed play. Through the Orpheum sound system, a gravelly voice filled the theater. "We need violence to justify the clearance. If they won't give it to us, we'll provide it ourselves. Target the young native kid. He's their leader. Take him out, the rest will fold." The recording continued for 47 seconds. Every word an indictment, every sentence a confession. By the end, several officers had removed their helmets. The crowd had gone from humming to dead silence. Sergeant McKinnon's radio crackled. "Unit 7, status report. Do you have the subject?" But McKinnon was staring at Samuel Running Bear, at this young man who looked like his nephew, who stood like his daughters stood when they were defiant but right. The sergeant thought about his oath to serve and protect. But serve who? Protect what? Then Bob Marley said 9 words that changed everything. "Sergeant, will you stand with justice or with orders?" McKinnon keyed his radio. The entire theater held its breath. 3,000 people waited to see if this would end in blood or something else, something that had never happened before in Vancouver, in Canada, maybe anywhere. "Dispatch," McKinnon said slowly. "We've investigated the scene. Subject is not at this location. False intel. We're pulling out." The radio exploded with confusion. "Unit 7, we have confirmed intelligence." McKinnon turned off his radio. He looked at his officers. "You heard me. We're leaving." "Sarge," one of the younger officers protested. "He's right there." "Where?" McKinnon asked. "I don't see any terrorist. I see a concert. I see citizens exercising their right to assembly. I see a young man discussing land rights. No terrorism here. It took the police 17 minutes to file out. The longest 17 minutes in Orpheum theater history. As they left, something unprecedented happened. The crowd began to applaud. Not for Bob Marley, not for the concert, for the police officers who chose conscience over career. Several officers nodded. Constable Liu was crying. Thompson stopped at the door, raised his fist in solidarity, then disappeared into the night. When the last officer left, the Orpheum erupted. But Bob raised his hand for silence. "This is not over," he said. "Samuel Running Bear still faces charges. The pipeline still threatens sacred land. The system that created this moment still exists. But tonight we proved something. We proved that when we stand together, even those sent to divide us can choose to unite with us." He turned to Samuel. "Brother, you have something to say?" Samuel took the microphone with trembling hands. What he said next would echo through Canadian history. "Tomorrow they'll come for me again. Maybe they'll arrest me. Maybe they'll disappear me. But tonight 3,000 witnesses heard the truth. Tonight 30 police officers chose justice over just following orders. Tonight Bob Marley turned a concert into a courtroom, and the courtroom ruled in favor of humanity." He paused, looking out at the crowd. "The pipeline they want to build will destroy 17 sacred sites. It will poison the water for 50,000 people. It will make 37 species extinct, all for oil that will be sold to foreign countries while we freeze in the dark. This isn't terrorism. This is sanity." Bob took back the microphone. "You know what we're going to do? We're going to finish this concert." But it's not just a concert anymore. It's a statement. Every song is testimony. Every note is evidence. And Samuel Running Bear is going to stand on this stage with us, protected by music, by community, by the truth. The Wailers looked uncertain. This could end their tour, get them banned from Canada. But Peter Tosh stepped forward, grabbed his guitar, and started playing Get Up, Stand Up. The rest of the band joined in. For the next 2 hours, Samuel Running Bear stood on stage with Bob Marley and the Wailers. He didn't sing, he didn't play, he just stood there. A living symbol of resistance. Occasionally Bob would hand him the microphone, and Samuel would share another piece of truth about the pipeline, about Indigenous rights, about the systematic destruction of his people's land. The audience listened. They learned. Many cried. Some got angry. But all of them understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. A concert that had become a consciousness-raising. A performance that had transformed into a protection ritual. At 11:47 p.m., as Bob launched into Redemption Song, they heard sirens, lots of them. The riot police had finally arrived. 200 officers surrounded the Orpheum. The order had come from the top. Premier Bill Bennett himself. Take Running Bear and arrest Marley for obstruction if necessary. The theater doors were barricaded from the inside. 3,000 people had collectively decided, without discussion, without planning, that Samuel Running Bear would not be taken tonight. Bob stopped singing. "They're here," he said simply. "The bigger guns, the bigger badges, the bigger fear." He looked at the crowd. "What do we do?" The response was unanimous. "Stand." What happened next made international headlines. The crowd linked arms. They formed human chains across every aisle, every exit, every possible entrance. The 70-year-old grandmother stood next to a teenage punk rocker. A businessman in a suit linked arms with a homeless veteran. They were black, white, indigenous, Asian, every shade of humanity, united by something stronger than fear. Bob began to sing again, this time One Love. The crowd sang along, their voices carrying through the walls to the police outside. The riot squad, prepared for violence, found themselves facing something they hadn't trained for: peaceful, absolute unity. Commander Patricia Hayes, leading the riot squad, spoke through a megaphone. "You have 5 minutes to surrender Samuel Running Bear, or we're coming in." Bob responded through the theater's external speakers. "Commander Hayes, you're welcome to join us, but violence will not enter here tonight. This is sacred space now." 2 minutes. Inside, Samuel made a decision that would define his life. "I'll go," he said to Bob. "I won't let anyone get hurt for me." "No," Bob replied. "This isn't about you anymore. This is about whether power respects people or people respect power. You stand. We all stand." 1 minute. The crowd began to sing louder. Some were crying. Others were praying. A group of Indigenous elders in the balcony began a traditional protection chant. The sound was overwhelming. 3,000 voices refusing to be silenced. "Time's up." The battering ram hit the main door. Once, twice. On the third hit, the door exploded inward. Tear gas canisters flew into the theater. People screamed. The human chains held for exactly 13 seconds before chaos erupted. But in those 13 seconds, something impossible happened that 47 witnesses would later swear to. The tear gas didn't disperse. It hung in the air like frozen smoke. The riot police pushed in but then stopped, confused. Their gas masks were fogging up from the inside. Their equipment was malfunctioning. Radios produced only static. Weapons jammed. Bob Marley stood on stage, still singing, tears streaming from the gas, but voice never wavering. Samuel Running Bear stood beside him, hands raised, not in surrender, but in defiance. The Wailers played on, their music somehow louder than the chaos. Then, from outside, another sound. Car horns, hundreds of them. The people of Vancouver had surrounded the police. They'd heard on the radio what was happening. They'd come, not to riot, just to witness, to stand with those inside standing. Commander Hayes, unable to see through her fogged mask, pulled it off. The gas should have incapacitated her immediately. But it didn't. It had somehow lost its potency. She stood in the doorway of the Orpheum, looking at 3,000 people looking back at her. That's when 7-year-old Lily Chen walked forward. Lily had been at the concert with her older sister. She was wearing a Bob Marley t-shirt that came down to her knees. She walked through the supposedly toxic tear gas, breathing normally, and stood in front of Commander Hayes. "Why are you being mean?" Lily asked. It was such a simple question, such a pure question. Hayes, mother of 3, looked down at this child, then looked at the chaos she'd created. The terrified faces. The elderly woman collapsed in the aisle. The young man on stage, whose only crime was loving his land. "Stand down," Hayes said into her radio. "Commander, repeat." "Stand down," she shouted. "All units withdraw. Now." The riot police looked confused. Several officers argued, but Hayes walked into the theater, threw her own tear gas, and approached the stage. The crowd parted, uncertain. She looked up at Bob Marley, at Samuel Running Bear. Then she did something nobody could have predicted. She took off her badge, set it on the stage, and said, "I quit." The Orpheum erupted again. But Hayes wasn't done. "Mr. Running Bear," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I've been a police officer for 15 years. I've followed orders I didn't believe in, arrested people who didn't deserve it. But not tonight. Tonight, I choose to be on the right side of history." She turned to her shocked subordinates. "Anyone who wants to join me in standing for justice over orders, for people over pipelines, for truth over lies, take off your badges." 7 officers immediately complied. Then 12 more. Within 3 minutes, 31 riot police had removed their badges and laid them on the stage. The pile of metal grew into a monument to conscience. Bob Marley started to sing again. A new song, improvised, that would never be recorded. When the badge becomes too heavy, set it down. When the order sounds like murder, turn around. When the child asks why you're crying, tell the truth. When the conscience finally finds you, that's the proof. Samuel Running Bear picked up one of the badges. These officers, he said, have shown more courage tonight than any warrior I know. It's easy to fight an enemy. It's harder to refuse to be one. But the night wasn't over. The phone in the theater office was ringing. Maria Gonzalez answered it. Her face went pale. She ran to the stage, whispered to Bob. His expression changed. He took the microphone. That was the Premier's office, Bob announced. Premier Bennett wants to speak with Samuel Running Bear, live, on stage, on CBC Radio, which is broadcasting now. He wants to negotiate. The crowd went silent. This was unprecedented. A sitting premier negotiating with a terrorist on live radio at a Bob Marley concert. Samuel took the phone that Maria had brought on stage. The conversation was broadcast through the PA system. Mr. Running Bear, Premier Bennett's voice, tired, stressed. I'm here. The world is watching Vancouver tonight. They're seeing either chaos or conscience. I prefer conscience. I'm prepared to offer you amnesty and a formal inquiry into the pipeline if you'll end this peacefully. Not just me. Amnesty for all land defenders. And the inquiry must be binding. There was a long pause. You're in no position to negotiate. Bob took the phone. Premier Bennett, this is Bob Marley. I've played for presidents and prime ministers. I've sung for revolutionaries and royalty. But I've never seen what I'm seeing tonight. You have a choice. Be remembered as the man who sent stormtroopers to a concert, or the man who chose peace over pipelines. Another pause. Longer. The entire Orpheum held its breath. Mr. Marley, you don't understand Canadian politics. I understand human politics, Bob interrupted. I understand that 3,000 voters are watching. That 31 police officers just chose conscience over career. That the world is seeing Canada choose between Indigenous rights and oil profits. What I don't understand is why you're hesitating. The next words would change Canadian history. Full amnesty, Bennett said finally, for all involved in the pipeline protests and a binding inquiry into Indigenous land rights. But Mr. Running Bear testifies publicly about everything. Samuel didn't hesitate. Deal. The Orpheum exploded into celebration. But Samuel raised his hand for quiet. This isn't victory, he said. This is a beginning. The pipeline isn't dead. The land isn't safe. We just bought time to fight with truth instead of our bodies. But I'll take it. Bob Marley resumed the concert. But it had transformed into something else. The pile of police badges remained on stage, glinting under the lights. Samuel Running Bear stood with the Wailers for the rest of the show. The 31 officers who'd quit stayed in the audience, some crying, some dancing, all transformed. At 1:17 a.m., as the concert ended with Exodus, something mystical happened. Every light in the Orpheum went out simultaneously. But instead of darkness, witnesses described seeing a soft blue glow, like bioluminescence, emanating from the crowd itself. It lasted for exactly 33 seconds. When the lights came back on, the pile of badges had been arranged into a perfect circle, a medicine wheel, though nobody had seen anyone touch them. Maria Gonzalez, filming from the lighting booth, captured it all. But when she reviewed the footage later, those 33 seconds showed something else. The theater filled with figures nobody remembered seeing. Indigenous warriors from centuries past, Chinese railroad workers, Japanese internment survivors, every group that had been labeled terrorist or enemy for standing up for their rights, all present, all witnessing, all nodding approval. Scientists called it mass hallucination. Skeptics called it exhaustion. But those who were there knew better. 3 years later, the pipeline was canceled. The inquiry had revealed centuries of land theft, environmental racism, and corporate corruption. Samuel Running Bear became a member of parliament, the youngest Indigenous person ever elected. His first act was to introduce the Marley Law, protecting the right to peaceful resistance against environmental destruction. Of the 31 officers who quit that night, 7 became land defenders, 12 joined Indigenous rights organizations. Patricia Hayes became a human rights lawyer, taking on police brutality cases. Jennifer Liu started a foundation for whistleblowers in law enforcement. Bob Marley would die 18 months after the Vancouver concert. But in his final interview, he said this: "Vancouver showed me something. It showed me that the uniform can come off, the badge can be set down, the order can be questioned, the human being is always there, underneath, waiting to choose love over law, when law forgets to be love." Sergeant Roy McKinnon, who'd led the first raid, visited Bob in the hospital a week before he died. He brought his 2 daughters, now teenagers, who'd become environmental activists, inspired by that night. "You asked me what I'd want if my daughters were at a concert," McKinnon said. "I'd want them to see what they saw, that courage is contagious, that conscience can overcome conditioning, that one person standing can make 30 people question why they're kneeling." Bob smiled weakly. "And Samuel, you ever arrest him?" "No. I retired the next day. Couldn't wear the uniform anymore knowing what I'd almost done." The Orpheum Theater has a plaque now, installed in 2020. It reads, "November 8, 1979. On this stage, music stopped violence, conscience defeated commands, and standing became sacred, in memory of Bob Marley, who taught us that redemption songs can redeem more than we imagine." Samuel Running Bear, now 50, still has the cassette tape with the evidence that saved him. He also has something else, a guitar pick Bob Marley gave him that night, with words scratched into it. "Standing is not terrorism. Standing is human. Stand up." The Vancouver incident, as historians call it, has been studied in police academies, protest movements, and peace studies programs worldwide. How did a concert become a courtroom? How did enforcement become endorsement? How did 30 guns yield to 3,000 voices? The answer, Bob Marley said that night, was simple. When the human recognizes the human, the uniform becomes just cloth. But there's one detail about that night that's never been officially reported. At exactly midnight, as Bob sang One Love, every recording device in the Orpheum, cameras, tape recorders, even the CBC's professional equipment, captured the same phenomenon. A voice neither Bob's nor anyone else's, identifiable, singing along in a language that linguists couldn't identify. Indigenous scholars later said it sounded like all Indigenous languages simultaneously. The voice sang for 17 seconds, then stopped. The only words that translated the same in every interpretation were these: "The ancestors are watching. The ancestors approve. The ancestors protect those who protect the land." Some say it was a technical glitch. Others say it was interference from the radio towers. But Samuel Running Bear knows what it was. So did Bob Marley. So did 3,000 witnesses who felt their hearts skip the same beat at the same moment. It was the land itself, singing through them, using their voices to say what it had been trying to say for centuries. "We are still here. We will always be here." And sometimes, just sometimes, even those sent to silence us will choose to sing with us instead. That's the revolution Bob Marley died believing in. That's the miracle that happened in Vancouver. That's why, every November 8th, people gather at the Orpheum to sing One Love at midnight. Badges and barriers set aside, standing together on stolen land, that for one night at least felt like it belonged to everyone and no one, to the past and the future, to the moment when music made justice possible.